Lynn, this question comes from a Russian diplomat in New York. And the question relates to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which over the last few days has released a report in which they say that the system of currencies and capital rules that currently bind the international financial system is not working properly, and according to them is what was largely responsible for the current financial and economic crises that we face globally. The UN in their report adds that the present system under which the dollar acts as the world's reserve currency should be subjected to wholesale reconsideration. The questioner says that although a number of countries, or at least leading economists in a number of countries, including China and Russia at various points, have suggested replacing the dollar as the world's currency, the UN report is the first time, to his knowledge, that a major multinational institution has posed this kind of suggestion. He says that in essence, what the report calls for is a new Bretton Woods-style system of managed international exchange rates, meaning that central banks would be forced to intervene and either support or push down their currencies, depending on how the rest of the world economy is behaving. The UN proposal also implies that surplus nations such as China and Germany should stimulate their economies further in order to cut their own imbalances rather than, as in the present system, deficit nations such as the UK and US having to take the main burden of readjustment. He quotes one of the authors of the report who says, replacing the dollar with an artificial currency would solve some of the problems related to the potential of countries running large deficits and would help stability. But you will also need a system of managed exchange rates. Countries should keep real exchange rates adjusted for inflation stable. Central banks would have to intervene, and if not, they would have to be told to do so by some multilateral institutions such as the IMF. He says, Mr. LaRouche, these proposals, to me, amount to a threat to national sovereignty and perhaps the most radical suggestions for redesign of the global monetary system that I have seen to date. Although many economists have pointed out that the economic crises that we currently face owe more to the malfunctioning of the post-Bretton Woods system, it still seems to me that this proposal is not a very good alternative. I ask you the question, however, because I know that this will come up as a major discussion as an alternative at the G20 meeting, and also because I know that this has been a source of massive debate, often very hostile debate, in my own country.
Well, the point is the whole issue is totally incompetent. The question, the problem is, we have been going, the world as a whole, beginning with the United States in, 66, 65. The United States went to zero growth, net zero economic growth in basic economic infrastructure. Since about 1968, 1973, the United States has been in a process of negative growth. Since the same period, 1967, 1973, Europe has been in a state of negative growth and real decadence. This negative growth has been a result of policies adopted by governments and adopted and encouraged by leading economists working inside those countries or for those governments. So I think it's free to say that the thinking of the UN, as described by the questioner, the thinking of the UN is a reflection of that habit of incompetence which has led to the present world crisis. And I don't think we need more of that incompetence as a stimulus for remedies. We don't need more injections with the disease which has caused the problem. And the problem has been caused by the incompetence of the economic policies of virtually every leading government of the world, in one way or the other. China, for example, take China. China has progressed, but China progressed on the assumption of being an exporter for other countries. That export market for China has disappeared. China's policy depended upon the assumption that that would not occur. Take Russia. Russia's policy was a stupid one, in a sense, despite what was accomplished by President Putin and then by President Medvedev. It's been foolish. Why? Because it based Russia's future on the gamble that the raw material sale from Russia to other countries would be the source of income from Russian growth. And now that market has collapsed. And Russia's in a crisis because it had the wrong policy of assuming certain things about the rest of the world's policies which are wrong. So I can take the case and prove it, and I have proven it, I think, repeatedly, that the policies of every part of the world have been aggregately insane in terms of their long-term effects over the past 40 years. We're in a mess today because of 40 years of wrong thinking. And then you got the economists come up and say, well, we're the expert. We're going to fix this for you. We're going to tell you how to fix it. They say, please, I had cancer once. Don't give it to me again. I don't need that anymore. And that's where the problem is. Now, there's only one thing. First of all, you've got to do, you must eliminate monetarism. You must use the United States as the proven standard under certain presidents, under its original intention of certain presidents, such as Lincoln, such as Franklin Roosevelt, and use those experiences to show the American system was the best system that was ever developed for economy on this planet. Except we had a problem. We had too much British influence inside Wall Street. And it was British influence and British traders inside the United States who loved the British Queen more than they loved their own country, which are the cause of our problems. Apart from the fact that Britain was an empire, we had trouble fighting against it for some period. But we defeated the British Empire under Lincoln. Palmerston went down, like a rocket. But what happened is that Lincoln was shot by the British. It was the British who killed him. This is an open fact. No question about that. Just like McKinley was assassinated. For example, McKinley. McKinley was a patriot, a seasoned patriot, and a competent president of the United States. But they got into trouble, and he put a bum in his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the nephew of the chief Confederate spy working for the British Empire in the Civil War. The guy, Teddy Roosevelt, was essentially a traitor to the United States. Now, at that point, under McKinley, the policy of the United States, in terms of Europe, was to try to make peace with France, which was a difficult problem at that time, and to rely upon the tradition of Bismarck's role in Germany, and to try to have relations with Russia, which are based on Bismarck's agreements with the Russian Tsar. That was our policy of war avoidance. We were going to cooperate with Germany and Russia and hopefully France against the British Empire. That was our policy. The assassination of McKinley by a British agent sent in from Europe to do the job with cooperation of the circles of Theodore Roosevelt in New York City, who was then the Vice President of the United States, brought President Theodore Roosevelt into power and a fundamental change in policy. It was Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration as president, in cooperation with what became the Woodrow Wilson administration, which installed the Federal Reserve System, which is the enemy of the U.S. Constitution. It was these arrangements that put the United States into its role in World War I, and despite the British, Franklin Roosevelt changed it. It was supposed to go the other way. Franklin Roosevelt was supposed to be on the side of the British in this thing, and he wasn't. He was on the side of the United States. And then when Roosevelt was out of office, they used Truman, who was a pig, to put us back in the same direction again. And over the entire period, the leading economists, with some exceptions in the United States, were traitors to the United States in terms of their way of thinking. Or either traitors or incompetent. Most of the economists I know some economists who are competent in varying degrees. Some of them are incompetent in specialties. Some are competent in history. Some are incompetent in certain aspects of national policy making. There are some of these people who I would obviously say should be called into it as key advisors of the present U.S. government, because they have the kind of knowledge which is needed to provide the government with a well-crafted policy, a foreign policy, economic policy, domestic policy. They exist. But in general, the leading theme of what is accepted on Wall Street and by the national press, the national news media, as economic policy has been clinically insane and even criminal. And it's those insane or variously criminal policies and misguidance which has led the nations of the world into this process, this mess, and especially the mess of the past 40-odd years. And we need no more from them on their way of thinking. We have to eliminate monetarism. We have to destroy, through bankruptcy reorganization, like an international Glass-Steagall Act. We have to purge the world of everything that smells of monetarism and rely only on sovereign nation states' lawful currency. We must bring into agreement to a global fixed exchange rate system. The way to do that is the dollar, because the dollar has no longer, since about 1973, has no longer been a controlling factor in international monetary affairs. The British Empire has been the controlling factor in international affairs. Eliminate the British Empire, and you suddenly find a different world. This all the filth in the world, all the evil, comes from the British Empire, which, as I said today, is not an empire of the people of the United Kingdom. It's an empire of an international monetarist interest. This monetarist interest is by its nature private, not public. The World International Monetary Fund is essentially a cabal of private interests, not nation interests. But the nations have been corrupted by monetarism. We must eliminate monetarism from this planet. All the agreements on reform of the international system have been failures from the outset by design, because they assume that we're going to have agreements among monetary systems, like those of John Maynard Keynes. And don't forget that in 1936, when John Maynard Keynes published his general theory, he published it first in Germany. And he selected Germany as the source of the place of its publication because he thought the policies of the present policies of Germany were more suitable to his policies than those of any other part of the world. In other words, Keynes was really a fascist. And the world has been influenced largely in the post-war world by the influence of John Maynard Keynes. And Keynesianism is one of the worst diseases on this planet. Eliminate monetarism. Go back to credit systems, fixed exchange rate credit systems of each nation of the world, and start with four nations which have to get rid of that pestilence right away: the United States, Russia, China, and India. And other countries will happily join that alliance. But the UN is largely a bad institution for that, because it's polluted by this kind of monetarist and similar kinds of liberal thinking. the very kind of thinking that brought us to this crisis since the day that Roosevelt died, and especially since 1968, when fascism ran amok in the streets of the United States in the name of the Wehrmacht, which was a cultural change which became the baby boomer movement, which destroyed the United States from the inside. And that's where we have to look at these things.